In 1987, a young waiter paid for a stranger's meal out of his own pocket without saying a word and without expecting anything in return. The stranger stood up, looked at the young man and said 3 words before walking out the door into the cold November night: "I will return." Thomas thought nothing of it. He was 22 years old and barely making rent, and by the following week he had forgotten about it entirely. He could not have known that those 3 words were going to come back to him 40 years later in a way that would permanently change everything he thought he understood about a single ordinary Tuesday night in a small-town diner. Thomas Callahan had been working the night shift at Millie's Diner on the corner of Birch Street and Route 9 since he was 19 years old. Millie's was not the kind of place that attracted attention. It had 12 tables, a counter with 8 stools, a pie display case that was mostly empty by 7 in the evening, and a neon sign in the window that buzzed faintly in cold weather. Thomas liked the night shift because it was quiet and because the regular customers were the kind of people who wanted coffee and something warm and did not ask for much. He was 22 that November, the year the leaves came down early and the town had its first frost in October. He was saving money to take 1 college class in the spring, and he had exactly enough in his account to do it if nothing unexpected happened at 11:43 on a Tuesday night. 15 minutes before Thomas was planning to close the register and mop the floor, the door opened. Thomas wiped down the counter and refilled the coffee and did not make conversation because he could tell that what the man needed was not conversation. At 12:15 the man put his cup down and sat quietly for a moment. Then he stood up and buttoned his jacket and turned toward the door. He paused with his hand on the door and turned back. He looked at Thomas with those pale, exhausted eyes and he said, "I will return." Then he walked out into the November night. Thomas watched the door close and then turned back to the counter and cleared the dishes and mopped the floor and went home. He thought about the man for a day or two and then he did not think about him again. Life continued. Thomas took his college class in the spring and then another one and eventually completed a degree while continuing to work at Millie's. He married a woman named Ruth who taught elementary school, and they bought a small house on the edge of town and had 2 children. And the years moved in the way that years do when you are busy living them. Millie's Diner was sold and became a hardware store and then a real estate office. Thomas eventually became the owner of a larger restaurant on the highway outside town and ran it for 23 years, and it became the kind of place that the town considered an institution. He was 62 years old when his phone rang on a Thursday morning in March. He did not recognize the number and he almost did not answer it. The man on the other end of the line had a voice that was measured and precise and unmistakably that of someone who was used to being listened to carefully. He said, "Is this Thomas Callahan who worked at Millie's Diner on Birch Street?" Thomas said yes. The man said, "My name is Richard Hale." Thomas did not recognize the name immediately, and then he did, because you would have had to have lived completely off the grid not to recognize the name Richard Hale, who was at that moment the chief executive officer of one of the 12 largest companies in the world, a logistics and technology corporation that operated in 43 countries and employed over 180,000 people. Thomas sat down. Richard Hale said, "I believe you and I met once in November of 1987. Thomas was quiet for a moment and then something moved in the back of his memory. A thin jacket, cracked shoes, pale eyes, coins counted carefully on a counter. He said, "The man with $2.11. Richard Hale said, "Yes." There was a brief silence. "I told you I would return," Richard Hale said. Thomas did not know what to say. Richard said, "I would like to come and see you if that would be acceptable. I have something I have been carrying for 40 years and I would like to deliver it in person." They met the following Tuesday at Thomas's restaurant after closing time. Richard arrived without an entourage, without security. He came alone and his eyes were still pale but rested now and clear and very direct. Thomas had put 2 cups of coffee on the table. They sat across from each other. Richard Hale put an envelope on the table between them. Thomas looked at the envelope. Richard said, "Before you open that, I want to tell you something about that night that you do not know." Thomas waited. Richard said, "I was not hungry that night in the way that a person is hungry when they have simply missed a few meals. I had been without a real meal for 4 days, but that was not the worst of it." He paused. "I had decided that morning that I was not going to continue," he said, his voice very level. "I had failed my entrance exams for the 3rd time. My father had told me not to come home. I had been sleeping in a bus station for 6 days. I was 26 years old and I had concluded with great certainty that there was no path forward that made sense to continue walking." Thomas sat very still. Richard said, "You brought me soup and coffee and a piece of apple pie and you took my $2.11 and you put them back in my hand and you did not ask me a single question and you did not look at me with pity and you made me feel like a person who was simply having dinner, and I had not felt like a person in quite a long time." The restaurant was completely silent. Richard said, "I walked out of that diner and stood on Birch Street in the November cold for a very long time and thought about the fact that a stranger had simply decided without any reason or obligation that I was worth a meal, and I decided to see what happened next." Thomas picked up his coffee and held it and did not drink it. Richard pushed the envelope across the table. Thomas opened it. Inside was a single document. It was the deed to the building that Thomas's restaurant occupied and the 2 adjacent buildings on either side of it and the parking lot behind them, all of which Thomas had been leasing from a property company for 23 years. At the bottom of the deed, in the section for the previous owner. The name of the property company was printed below it in the section for current owner was Thomas's name. Thomas looked up. Richard said, I bought those buildings 16 years ago when I first had the resources to find out who owned them. I have been your landlord for 16 years. Thomas stared at him. I kept the rent low. Richard said, my property managers had instructions. This does not balance what you did. Richard said, because what you did cannot be balanced. It was not a transaction. It was simply a decision that you made about another person's worth, and it cost you $5 and it gave me 40 years. He stood up and buttoned his dark coat. I am sorry it took me so long to return, he said. He shook Thomas's hand and walked out the door. Thomas sat alone at the table in his restaurant for a very long time. He thought about a Tuesday night in November 40 years ago, and a plate of soup and a cup of coffee and a piece of apple pie. He thought about $5 from his apron pocket. He thought about how he had not done it because he expected anything. He had done it because a person was sitting at his counter and a person was hungry, and that had seemed like reason enough. Outside the window the March evening was cold and clear and the streetlights were coming on one by one. Thomas picked up his coffee and drank it. It was still warm.